Welcome, everyone out there in the Bosshole Transformation Nation. This is your host, John Broer, and we are so glad to have you here for this episode of the Bosshole Chronicles. Today, I have a subject matter expert episode for you, and you are going to meet a gentleman by the name of Steve Ingalls. Steve is the president and CEO of a company called Catalyzer. Catalyzer is based in Lansing, Kansas, and their consultants travel all over the place to provide their unique brand of leadership development and organizational consulting. And please be sure to check out their link in the show notes. But let me tell you a little bit about Steve. Steve is a 1982 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He retired as a lieutenant colonel after a 22-year career in the Army, so thank you for that, Steve. In addition to that, check this out. He holds a Master of Science in Engineering Management from the University of Kansas, a Master of Military Art and Science from the United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and it gets better, a Master of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And he's a former instructor and assistant professor of aerospace engineering at West Point and an instructor of tactics at the Command and General Staff College. Now, with all of those amazing credentials, here is an individual who, by personal experience, recognized the power and the importance of emotional intelligence. And that's what he's going to talk to us about today. I think that's probably what I love about Steve's story so much, is that it is all based, his focus and the work that he does is based on his personal journey and his growth through self-awareness and adaptation and the development of his tools or skills of emotional intelligence that we get to understand how he approaches that with his clients today. So settle in, get ready, great episode, and let's get to it. The Bosshole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. Well, Steve Ingalls, it is absolutely great to have you here on the Bosshole Chronicles. Welcome.
Thanks, John. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I am excited that our listeners will get a chance to learn a bit more about the work that you do. I mean, they heard in the introduction a little bit more about your past and your credentials, your bio, Catalyzer, and so forth. And we're going to talk about the really remarkable work that you and the team at Catalyzer are doing around leadership development. But I thought it would be helpful for everybody to hear a bit more of the origin story, because your roots and your experiences clearly have shaped the work that you're doing today, and especially the work around emotional intelligence. So take us back, if you will, a few chapters and let us know where this idea or this work really began.
So the organization's been around since 2009, and I recall gathering in Chicago for what we now historically refer to as the conclave. No disrespect to the Catholic Church, but it did seem as though there was somebody going to put some chimney up this or smoke up the chimney at some point.
All right.
And as we left that meeting, which was really my introduction to the organization at the very beginning, as we left that meeting, someone suggested that we were going to incorporate modules around the notion of emotional intelligence. And I had a very visceral reaction to that. And maybe from a personal perspective, my context is this. I'm an aerospace engineer by training. So I have the engineering mindset. I went that way for a reason. Some would say, maybe in jest, that engineers go that way because they don't deal with people all that well. And so I was an aerospace engineer. I'm a firstborn son. I spent 22 years in the Army, as I know the bio pointed out, and I did that in combat units in what I would say are very, very aggressive, focused, disciplined environments where I fell prey to some of that kind of legend and psyche around what leaders looked like. So my reaction was the notion that I don't want to do this. But it really came to bear when I was working my second job away from uniform In 2006, I went to the University of Kansas, and I stumbled. I remember reminding the people that were hiring me, do you really know who you're getting here?
Okay.
Absolutely true. I know exactly who I'm getting. Well, it resulted in my being referred to human resources pretty regularly. And I did happen to work for a boss that was every bit as nasty as I was when I was in uniform in those days.
Okay.
And a young man, Terry Proctor, after a very short conversation, suggested to me that I had a challenge with the concept of emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
And so, as a means of coaching me along those lines, he gave me some self-assessments to go take. And in the days, unlike what we get to experience these days, they largely involved a website where the website would present a picture to you, and you would be asked to identify what's going on in the picture. In the common framework around the skills of emotional intelligence, they're asking you for your social awareness.
Mm-hmm.
But I recall looking at these photographs and thinking to myself, my engineer mind, I haven't the foggiest idea what's going on in this picture. I don't know whether this was a posed picture and everybody was told to say cheese, or whether there's someone holding a knife behind someone's back. And my response reflected what I thought is, I haven't the foggiest idea. Well, the self-assessment comes back fail. Move on to the second and third self-assessments. They all came back with the same result because the self-assessments were all similar. I recall going back to Terry and telling him what I had done. He says, well, try this on for size. And so he hands me a stack of research papers that were essentially championing the notion of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took them home with me. And the very first paper that I opened that Terry gave me, the lead sentence in the very first paragraph pronounced that psychopaths demonstrate low emotional intelligence. So not only,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sure you chuckle at it now, but it's like at the time, probably a little bit, it probably got your attention.
it did, and in not the way that I think he intended.
Right.
Because a trigger for me is intelligence. So the whole phraseology around emotional intelligence is somewhat problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an engineer, so what does emotion have to do with it?
Right.
And now you're telling me I'm not good at emotional intelligence, so you're telling me in some way that I'm stupid. And now you've added to that particular label, you've added the notion that somehow I'm psychopathic. So I went back to Terry's office without reading another word in those papers, and I wadded up that research paper and I threw it at Terry and hit him in the head. And I'm pretty confident that I made the point that he was trying to make in that moment, which was, this is an area for my development that was very important. I dismissed the whole thing until midlife. And this is in my 50s now. So I want to dispel the notion that old dogs cannot be taught new tricks. I dismissed that completely. But there were a number of things in my life that came together that were very frustrating. I had a child that was not performing in his transition to adulthood in the way that I wanted. I was certainly failing in my judgment at work, despite having had what I thought was a very successful military career. I was well educated. I thought I'm in my prime earning years, and yet here I am not very happy with where I am. And all of that begins to then slip over into my relationship with my spouse. And so all these tenets of my life are not going as well as I wanted. And as a true engineer would do when anything goes wrong, they do a little root cause analysis. And so I pulled each of them apart and realized this. The only objective finding from that analysis was that I had been present for every one of those failures.
Right.
I was an element. And so what I decided I would do in that moment is attempt maybe the only thing that I hadn't done yet. And so I dove into a study of emotional intelligence. And at the time, there were two primary books. Dan Goleman had written the book Emotional Intelligence. I believe that was the middle 2000s. Shortly later, it introduced the book Primal Leadership. And I read both of them cover to cover. And frankly, his approach to telling me how the brain works and that essentially my brain's reaction to the things that were happening to me was normal. He made it normal that I got angry. He made it appropriate that I got angry, that I had a short temper. It wasn't about being abnormal, but it was all about how do I respond to that in an appropriate way. And it's back to the old Geico commercials. If you remember the Geico caveman commercials.
I do.
I decided I didn't want to behave like a caveman. And our brain is designed to function. You know, we get triggered in our basal ganglia. We get our emotions come out of our limbic system, and our logic and reasoning, for which I hold a great regard, is in my neocortex. And I wasn't using my neocortex in my professional or personal life. I was responding like a caveman. And so in that moment, I decided to take it on. We built that as an integral element of all of our programs. And I do think that the result has been, I'm a happier, more effective, confident boss than I was in those earlier days where I dismissed the whole concept.
So our listeners will be very comfortable with the concept of building self-awareness.
Right.
So you had a period of profound self-awareness. You were seeing the impact around you in your family and your personal life. And you didn't, what we would say, Steve, is that you didn't change, but your self-awareness helped you recognize the need for adaptation with what you had. I mean, you're not gonna change how you are, as we would say, your behavioral DNA, but your awareness of its impact absolutely gave you the fuel to be able to adapt and embrace the tools of emotional intelligence. And that's exactly what they are, the tools of emotional intelligence. And we use EQI 2.0. I think you are very familiar with EQI 2.0. They help people get unstuck. But here's the other thing. Just because of the place where you had found yourself didn't make you wrong. I mean, again, I think we have a tendency to say, oh, well, that person's just wrong, or we blame them for a lack of self-awareness or lack of tools. And you realized, I understand how this can work. I just need to embrace it myself. I just think that is such a profound step that you took after you recognized what was happening around you. And not a lot of people get to that point. Would you agree?
I think that life is a great teacher. And ultimately, when we succeed time and again, when we're awarded degrees or get the job or get the raise or get the promotion, all of those things in some way you receive as a referendum on your own behavior. And yet I was unhappy. Right. And so I find myself, despite all of those things that I felt like I'd been able to accomplish, unsatisfied with my professional life and personal life on a level. And it was simply a matter of taking the time to reflect. And I think that our time to reflect, especially in these busy times that we operate in, the time to reflect is really an endangered species. And we do not make that time to sit and think. We just don't. We don't journal. We don't take long walks. We don't sit around the table and ponder things like we may have in the past. And our lack of ability to make that time to reflect really, I think, gets in the way of our own self-awareness. So that was an awakening for me, but that's only part of the journey. I can be self-aware and I can still be a boss hole.
Yeah.
Frankly, right? I can know that I'm difficult. I just choose to not do anything about it. And that's where the others, we refer to them as skills of emotional intelligence. That's where the skill comes in of self-managing. Now that I know that this is the way that I am, I have to do something with it.
So before we get to the skills and start to talk about how you apply it today in your work at Catalyzer, for you, Steve, I am a huge proponent of what I would call quiet time, or some would say mindfulness. I mean, shutting things out or shutting things down to think or reflect, or sometimes it's just be at peace to
calm yourself. For what did you find works for you? I love these actual examples. What works for you?
I'm a reader.
Okay.
And among the things that I think I have a superpower with is I'm a good dot connector. I see common frameworks regardless of the source of that information. I see frameworks that reside across these various books in some cases. So I do that, and I stop and I reflect on what the author is saying and what they're trying to teach. That's one. Bad habit. I'm a cigar smoker.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the things that I use to slow myself down is I will get up from my desk. I did it this morning for about an hour. I get up every morning toward the end of the morning when I'm starting to get to that midday doldrum area. I go outside and I sit. And my sitting time, which is about an hour and a half, that's about the time that my dog wants to lay there next to me. But
right.
My sitting time typically involves a cigar. I have a book sitting next to my lawn chair in the garage. So I will read. I'll probably play a game on my iPhone, which is completely distracting from everything else that's going on until I lose in a streak, and then I'll go back to reading again.
Right.
And after the dog, my golden retriever Bailey, has had enough, we normally come in, and now I'm ready to start the afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know there are people listening that would go, wow, I wish I had the luxury of that kind of time. And I will ask those people to change the way you think about it. It is not a luxury. It is a necessity. In order to create balance and to steady yourself. And it's different for everybody. Whether it's taking a walk, sitting down, playing a game, having a cigar. I mean, this is not an endorsement of smoking cigars, but I do miss a good cigar. And especially with a nice glass of port. That's also nice. But anyway, side note, you have to find what that is.
Right.
My time in the morning is I get up early in the morning. I do work right away. I have a cup of coffee and I'm working right away, but then I take the dog for a walk, and I mean, that's my quiet time. I will pray during my walk. It will just be a time to escape. I won't take the phone with me. And it's not a long time, but it is a time to really clear your head, if you can, of things that you'll be tending to when you get back into the office. So I don't consider that a luxury. I think that's absolutely a necessity to be an effective, quite frankly, an effective human being these days.
Right. One of the habits that I have made for myself, especially given the amount of time that we travel, is I try very hard not to bury my head in the phone when I'm sitting around an airport.
Okay.
Humans are gloriously messy and fun to watch. And so if you're sitting, I've done this before, sit around an airport boarding area and simply count the heads that are down, buried in a phone, versus the heads that are up, and looking around. It's a ridiculously out of balance proportion, percentage. And you think to yourself, what are they missing? This is an opportunity for me to be quiet and to take in what's going on around me. But we just aren't doing that these days. In fact, there are some people, if they're not on a phone, it's only a few minutes before they find themselves very uncomfortable. So they're digging into the phone and calling somebody unnecessarily just to let them know that they've arrived at the airport or that they're going someplace. It's almost, we're self-conscious about the fact that we're not busy.
Yes.
And that is also getting in the way of all of this.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Well, and right now we are seeing, and you may be seeing it at Catalyzer, an awful lot of, especially in the middle management ranks, you see an inordinate amount of burnout. I mean, I don't think it's new. This is something that has been building for a while.
Right.
And it is just it's a hard thing to watch because you see people that are beating themselves up because maybe they don't feel like they're meeting expectations, or maybe they got a boss hole that's really driving them. But a lot of this is self-imposed, I think, to a certain degree. As you said, if I'm not keeping busy, I must not be doing anything. And I think that's what do they call it? The tyranny of the urgent. I think that could be our undermining.
And we will be right back.
With employee disengagement at its highest level in 9 years, your company can't afford to miss the mark when it comes to optimizing your hiring, management, and team performance practices. At its lowest level, employee turnover costs you $11,000 per person, and those are dollars you can easily save with the right set of people analytics. Real Good Ventures is a talent optimization consultancy specializing in world-class analytics specific to your people and the critical role they play within your organization. Gain confidence in your hiring practices, keep the boss holes from driving your talent away, design your teams for flawless execution, and create a culture that offers meaning and fulfillment. Real Good Ventures has a family of validated diagnostic tools specific to the human aspect of business, because we know that all business issues are people issues. Visit us today at www.realgoodventures.com and bring meaning and fulfillment back into your workplace.
Okay, let's get back to the program.
Steve, let me ask you this. When you think about emotional intelligence at Catalyzer, I know that you do all types of leadership development, coaching. One of the things that you do around conflict resolution, I mean, you have some very specific work around conflict resolution. Can you help us understand your approach to conflict resolution as it relates to emotional intelligence? I mean, the two are they're interdependent. I would have no doubt. But there's a lot of conflict that needs to be resolved in the workplace these days, and I don't think people are really stepping into the danger, as Patrick Lencioni would say. Help us understand that a little bit more.
So the central model that we use when we talk about conflict resolution is a model that were developed by two researchers, a gentleman named Colvin, Colvin, and Sugai, Sugai. Now, ironically, or maybe a little bit interestingly, that model was developed in an attempt to try to de-escalate conflict that elementary school educators were encountering with their children.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And in some cases, there are some references that would suggest it was developed for children that were on the spectrum on some level. And it has 7 phases to it, and it runs as a life cycle. So if you start over time, let's go left to right. And on the vertical axis of their model, it looks like a mountain peak. On the vertical axis is intensity of the conflict. So you're moving along and you're essentially at the status quo or normal. At some point, you get triggered. And so that trigger is point number 2. And now the intensity begins to escalate a little bit. Mm-hmm. Beyond the trigger is a phase called agitation. And that's when we're not letting it go. We get triggered all the time. We get triggered driving down the road and someone cuts us off or surprises us with an unexpected brake light. It's the agitation. That's where we let things start to take a life of their own.
Okay.
Now, both for trigger and for agitation. At the trigger point, if I have been triggered face to face with somebody, there are only 2 people involved in this conflict at this point.
Okay.
I've been triggered, or maybe I've triggered you. Triggering and what triggers us is an element that we would argue is part of our self-awareness. We should take a step back and journal a bit in those reflective moments about the times that we've just become spitting mad and what was at the root cause of it. In fact, in the EI 2.0 book that you referred to, there's a table somewhere around page 19, as I recall, that talks about reactions and emotions and maybe underlying symptoms, the things that are ultimately making us mad. For me, I have a very short temper still, but it's mostly about respect and deference. If I can take all of those triggering events down to respect and deference. Still, it's between me and some other person that has triggered me. It's a self-awareness exercise for us to know and understand what our triggers are. Now, the second thing that we advocate as part of the trigger conversation, and I'm still only here in the very early stages of the conflict, is that once we've reflected on what our triggers are, I think it's incumbent upon us to share those in an emotionally intelligent way with our colleagues.
Okay.
And I'm not suggesting that anybody say, all right, everybody gather around. Let me tell you what really pisses me off.
Okay.
That's not the conversation that I'm suggesting that we have. But the alternative is that if we're triggered, the alternative is that we're going to be driving ourselves toward an out of control condition. And whether the person that is triggering us knows that or not, the circumstance for us is the same. We're being driven to an out of control condition.
Okay.
So if they don't know and they trigger us, the challenge is that I'm still tickled in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
If they do know and they trigger us, that's a different conversation. And so the sharing aspect of triggers gets to the emotional intelligence domain of social awareness. I know what triggers you, John. You know what triggers me. If we are appropriately professional colleagues, we're going to avoid those triggers, or we're going to recognize when we do it inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
So that's the first step. And people will generally buy into the notion that you should reflect on the triggers. They get that. They don't buy into the notion nearly as strongly that you should share them out with your colleagues, because then they feel as though they become vulnerable to the level that they're going to have their buttons pushed all the time.
Right.
But I'm suggesting that, well, if you don't, then your folks are discovering your triggers by accident, and I don't think that's a productive place to go.
Okay.
The next place you go is agitation. Now we've gotten beyond our triggers, and we've gotten to the point where some of us simply live as a means of responding to conflict very close to what we call the euphemistic launch button.
Mm-hmm.
We are pot stirrers.
Okay.
And that also is a self-awareness exercise. Is to what degree am I a pot stirrer? Or to what degree am I an agitator? And there are people that we've bumped into, and we're guilty of it as well, that will respond to every minor circumstance as if it's an affront, and then we don't let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the degree to which as we reflect on ourselves, what's the degree to which we're pot stirrers? Still, at this level, there's only two people involved.
Right.
And if we understand that about each other, we should be able to work that out. I don't need the boss to swoop in, other than perhaps to coach us that emotional intelligence is the remedy here to conflict management.
Right.
I don't need a mediation at this stage. It's a get out of my office and go do some adulting. Right? So this is our approach. This is the strong connection between emotional intelligence and conflict resolution, given the Colvin and Sugai model. If you get beyond agitation, you start to get to what they refer to in phase 4 as acceleration. Acceleration is now where it's gotten to the point where it's a wildfire, and it requires a third party now to sit in. And this is where the level of intensity has gone up. We're not able to manage it ourselves effectively. It's possible that a third party can walk us back down that curve, but it requires a level head, and we're not level-headed when we get beyond the agitation phase.
Right.
And there are a variety of tools that you could employ at this stage. The one that we advocate is simply, there are a couple of references about fierce conversations or difficult conversations, any mediation technique, any negotiation reference. This is what you do when you step in. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to find that middle ground, that party, and I'm not talking about compromise, I'm trying to talk about the truth. Mm-hmm. When we're having these discussions is, what is it that's going on here? Because the two of you are blinded by your own lack of emotional intelligence in the moment. You can't see it. If we allow it to progress beyond the acceleration phase, what Colvin and Sugai say, it continues to ramp in intensity up to the peak. And here's unfortunately where businesses leave conflict. It gets up to the peak. We as outside mediators, as the boss holes, either didn't have the courage to deal with it or we avoided dealing with it. And so we've allowed it now to progress up to the peak. And that's where too many organizations are allowing conflict to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're just, no news is good news. I'm going to allow Steve to be who he is. I'm going to allow John to be who he is. But the problem is, for an organization, now they're going to have to take all kinds of effort to keep us apart, not assign us collaborative roles because they know we don't get along.
Right.
They've done nothing to moderate the conflict.
Yeah. So this is
right?
the fifth level at the peak.
Fifth level. You ultimately have essentially 3 or 4 solutions when it gets to the peak. One of them I refer to the nuclear solution. I'll blow the whole thing up and you're both gone.
Mm-hmm.
That ought to be a last resort.
Sure.
Right? Especially in these day and ages when we have such an investment in our people to begin with. The second option would be to declare a winner. Not everybody can win all the time. And so there is a truth. Sometimes I'm right. A lot of times I'm wrong. So declare a winner. We could live with it at the peak. And now we get into that notion of, there's some references that suggest that leaders spend as much as 40% of their week on conflict management.
Yeah.
Well, when I spend 40% of my week on conflict management, another 60% of my week on emails, and another, 200 hours a year on performance reviews, when am I doing any work?
Right.
So we could live with it. That's a horrible solution. Or we can figure out how to walk it back down. And we're going to walk it back down on the front side by perhaps figuring out a solution, trying to get somebody, or we might even de-escalate it, which gets to the other side of the curve. If you're able to de-escalate it and get beyond that peak, you come down the other side of the mountain beyond the peak, and that is the de-escalation phase, 6. And then you get back to a new normal, the new status quo, if you manage to get back to it. And that new status quo, it can take any number of forms. The same person that coached me on conflict management suggested that all conflict leaves a bruise. And so our new normal is not nearly as quiet, quote unquote,
right,
as our former normal. But I do leave open the possibility that maybe we get it back down to the previous status quo. And I've had colleagues suggest to me that in some of their conflicts, especially with family members, walking through that and getting to that new normal actually resulted in a stronger relationship.
Interesting. Okay.
Now, that's the curve. That's the Colvin and Sugai curve, and intensity on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. Here's what leaders fail to recognize about conflict. We're not managing a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We're managing a portfolio of conflict.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
And if that portfolio happens to align in just the right way, where we have a lot of very high intensity dysfunctional conflicts in our portfolio that over time coincide, you now have the old junior high school physics video where the Tacoma Narrows Bridge is collapsing because we've gotten into resonance. And that's all we're spending our time doing.
Right, for sure.
So emotional intelligence, clearly, before we get to that agitation phase, is a critical conflict management technique.
So it's really preventative. I mean, emotional intelligence,
right,
in terms of conflict, if appropriately positioned and applied, is preventative, because we are hopefully dealing with two people that have that level of self-awareness. And we would use predictive index and there are a number of other tools, but to develop profound self-awareness and then understand the skills of emotional intelligence to make sure we don't ramp this thing up to the peak.
Right.
And I am thinking, as you're walking through this, Steve, I'm thinking of people I know and relationships I've experienced. And I'm thinking of an individual who we like to assume benign intent. I mean, if somebody says something or does something and maybe they didn't realize it could be offensive or trigger somebody, to use that terminology. It's on the other side of it when it's done with intent. When somebody is purposefully trying to activate somebody or trigger them. Now that's a whole nother. I mean, so they are trying to create. They're a pot stirrer. They are trying to stir the pot, and yet they don't back off. They don't recognize that this isn't healthy, this isn't good. And I'm thinking, and sometimes when that's a manager, man, we have got somebody who is residing in the boss hole zone for sure.
Sure.
You looked at the manager as somebody who could come in and help resolve it, but there are plenty of circumstances where the manager is at the heart of this, and that just compounds the issue for the other person on the receiving end.
No doubt, you and maybe the people listening have heard that someone suggest a notion that a little conflict is healthy in an organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
There's a fair amount of meta studies that have been accomplished that suggest be very, very careful with that.
Mm-hmm.
There are various types of intra-organizational and inter-organizational conflict, and only in one small circumstance are the results even mixed. Otherwise, they're all negative.
Yes.
So you're lighting a wildfire in a red zone area of your organization and hoping that you're able to control it when you purposefully introduce conflict.
Right. And
Stop it.
And you're heaving, gallons of gasoline all over the place, hoping that, oh yeah, I'll be able to contain this in some way. Quick story. I had a client years ago before Real Good Ventures, and this was a really toxic organization. But when I tell you this, you'll understand why. The leadership found a book. I don't know what the title was, but it was about managing through chaos. Not through chaos that was occurring, but like creating chaos as a management skill, or as a way to run an organization. And I thought, hold on a second. And I remember talking to the president of the company. I said, you don't have enough natural conflict or chaos just in the way business is done that you need to manufacture it. I said, that is one of the most unhealthy things I've ever heard an organization do. And it was horrible. It was it was a very short-lived experiment. But to your point, let's not try to, create it. You got enough. And if we don't understand how to deal with what we do have, adding more of it is only going to compound the problem.
None of us exist in an organization of perfectly programmed robots.
Right.
None of us. I mean, I have conflict in the engine of my car. That's why we put oil there.
Right. Exactly.
And so humans being even more gloriously messy than, the finely engineered engine in my Ford, I can't imagine why you would purposefully do it.
I know. Well, there was I consider it a great experience because it was a collection of people, a couple of them classic boss holes, and we learned some great stuff from them. But
sure.
Yeah, why that happens and why people, it's like this. Sometimes you run into managers or business leaders who think that this is some big social experiment, and we're just gonna, it's like a big petri dish at our organization. It's like, let's be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that these are human beings, and there are plenty of ways to deal with this that are healthier and not going to make it any worse. Steve, that is great. I mean, thank you so much for that walk on the process of conflict resolution. Love the 7 steps and how emotional intelligence ties into it. What's, just real quick as we start to wrap things up,
sure.
What's on the horizon for you? I mean, we're, in sort of in the middle of 2023. What are you excited about? What's around the corner? Let's hear a little bit of what's happening at Catalyzer and maybe
Sure.
for you personally.
Yep. So professionally, the organization has, we were only off the road 88 days during the pandemic.
Okay.
We came off the road on the 13th of March, and we were back on the road in June.
Okay.
We felt like we were kicked out of Ohio, and as soon as organizations were comfortable having us back, we were back in.
Right.
We travel every other day. The feedback on the programs that we deliver continues to be incredibly positive. The opportunities to build new programs around the new things that organizations are now struggling with, predominantly, how do we retain the workforce that we've worked so hard to get? That's the number one issue on the top of leaders' minds, and it's industry agnostic. And just as a pitch, the things that you have been doing, you should probably put those aside with some Einsteinian thinking that, the brain that got you into this problem will not get you out of it, because we're there.
Right.
And everything should be on the table. So I'm excited about that opportunity. to continue talking about that. We have some partnerships with some organizations that have shared some intellectual capital with us around innovation specifically. The clients that we work with could continue to give us thoughts on the kinds of topics they would like to address. And so the business is thriving. We were the best we've ever been last year in terms of the numbers, but the relationships too continue to be really, really satisfying.
Right.
The personal stuff is I'm getting to this stage of my life where things come easier, maybe through some experience, and yet they're not easy, if that makes any sense.
Sure, it does.
But I've been there enough to be able to watch and see somebody's foot before they step on the landmine, the figurative landmine.
Right.
And so that's the nature of the team that we've got. So I get great satisfaction. I too get up every morning and I go immediately to work. I try very hard to do something creative with that time in the morning, because that's when my brain is the most creative, rather than the mundane activity of managing emails, which I keep to mid-afternoon when I'm in my post-lunch slump.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I'm about to celebrate my 41st wedding anniversary with my spouse. My children are happy and professional, and I include my daughter-in-law in that. She is my favorite child of the three, largely because my sons will listen to this and they'll say, yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, fair enough. I didn't know if I had to edit that out, but go ahead.
No, not at all. I've made that no secret. But my daughter-in-law, she and my son have blessed us with some grandchildren that are changing the way that I think about leadership. They lead me in unusual ways, and that's a mistake that I think I've made in the past. When we think about mentors and coaches, we oftentimes think up.
Right.
But they influence me to think and to behave in a way that I hope is mirrored in some of my professional work. And there are 3 of them now, from 10 to 2. And we are going to welcome a 4th into the world at the end of August. So those are the things I'm looking forward to.
Well, congratulations. That's awesome. And we are not grandparents yet. Hopefully one day, but I have had plenty of friends and family that said it is not like nothing you've ever experienced being a grandparent. So congratulations. And interestingly enough, we just published an episode. Martin Ramirez was the guest, and he published a book called Whose Fault Is It When You Find Your Purpose? Great. I mean, really, it was a delightful interview that Sarah had with Martin, but he credits his son, Mario, who was born with Down syndrome, as being his greatest mentor, because it was like in the most surprising ways, who he is and what he does and how he approaches life has had a profound impact on Martin. So I love that. When we're looking for mentors and coaches, let's look in all directions, because you never know where that may come from. Right. Steve, this has been an absolute pleasure. I just want to remind our listeners, please go check the show notes. You will see Steve's contact information in there, Catalyzer's contact information. Go to the website, look at what they're doing. By the way, do I recall correctly that most, if not all, the members of the Catalyzer team are former members of the armed forces? Is that correct?
Many are.
Many are.
And that's been a dynamic that has begun to tail off over time. But, when you're looking to hire somebody or build an organization, you go to the people that you know the best. And that was our circumstance for sure.
Well, listen, many thanks to you and the rest of the staff for their service then and now. And it's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
Thanks, John. I enjoyed it.
All right, everybody. Thanks again. And we'll see you next time on the Bosshole Chronicles. We'd like to thank our guests today on the Bosshole Chronicles. And if you have a Bosshole Chronicles story of your own, please email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Once again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you again soon.